Hello, everyone. We're going to start the session in about 5 to 6 minutes. But just as a reminder to everybody that you do have a questions box that is available to you. If at any point in time you do have any questions, please feel free to post those questions in that box that's there, and we'll do our best to answer the questions during the webinar, or probably if we can't get to it during it, we'll try our best to do it at the end of the webinar. So again, we'll start in about, let's say about 6 minutes, so one after the actual start time. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's about 2 minutes until the start time. We're actually going to start a minute right after the start. So we'll start in about 3 minutes. But just as a reminder to everyone, there is a questions box that is available to you in your control panel. Please feel free to post any questions that you may have in that panel. So post a question and we'll do our best to answer that question during the webinar. If not, if we don't do it during it, we'll try our best to get to it at the end. So again, we'll start in about 3 minutes. Thanks. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of the DMARC Bootcamp. This is the last session of the week. We do have one more at midnight, but otherwise this is the last session for the bootcamp. So just to review over where we've gotten so far. So weeks 1 and 2, we're about getting started. So we gave a high-level overview of what DMARC is, why it's important, and why it's critical. So why you're actually going through this whole bootcamp. And then in week 2, we talked about SPF and DKIM. So we went into detail about that and what's involved with both of those mechanisms and how DMARC is utilizing both of those for authentication and for authorization. So these 2 weeks here that we're in and about to end is weeks 3 and 4 is where we're actually talking about the implementation of DMARC. So what we're going to do in this session is basically go through the DMARC policy in detail. So we'll talk about the different components involved when we're creating a DMARC record and how then to create those records. So we're going to show you how to create a DMARC record, an SPF and DKIM record, but we're going to do it only on a cloud-based DNS provider. Right? The past 2 sessions were for DNS and for bind. So those recordings should be up either later today or by tomorrow in case you want to review those. Just realize that the first half of that session is going to be exactly what we're going to do today. So we'll talk about all the tags and everything associated with the DMARC policy, and then it's the last half that it's going to be different, where we focus on cloud-based DNS provider. And the other thing is that we really strongly encourage you to go ahead and implement DMARC during these last few weeks, right? At least implement it at the lowest level. Why? Because this is where you put it in. We're showing you what to do. We're showing you how to do it. So go ahead and get started. Why wait? Get started and start collecting those DMARC reports, because in weeks 5 and 6 is all about ongoing management. So analyzing, reviewing, and adjusting your records. So DMARC, SPF, and DKIM. So the focus is going to be these. We have 7 different organizations and subject matter experts that deal with DMARC and deal with DMARC reports pretty much every day, or every so often. So they know this, and they're going to tell you what these reports are. What do they mean? What are you going to analyze? What analysis needs to be done? What needs to be reviewed within these reports? And then what records need to be adjusted based on what you're seeing in these DMARC reports, right? Because this is what you're going to do in order to move up to an enforcement level policy for DMARC. So you don't have to attend all of the week 5 and 6 sessions, at least attend 2 of those. Right, but then also on the end of week 6, on October 17th, will be a wrap-up session. So we'll just kind of do a quick overview or review of everything that was talked about the past few weeks, and then also talk about some additional standards that work with DMARC, and then some other ones that you can use as well in conjunction and alongside with DMARC if you choose to. So those are the things we're going to do in those last few weeks. So we haven't talked about DMARC since week 1, right? We just gave a very high level overview of what the different parts are and the different components. But now let's get back to it and review it again. So what is DMARC? So DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance, right? Because it has those 3 components: authentication, reporting, and conformance. So when you deal with DMARC, what it's going to do is provide an identity check for your domain. So that way it's not being used for fraudulent use in the email side. Right, so it's protecting email when you implement DMARC. Now remember, when it comes to DMARC, there's 2 parts to this. There's 2 sides. There's the DMARC policy, and there's the DMARC verification. So what you have to do as the sending organization is create a DMARC policy. So this is something you actually have to create, and you actually have to implement, because there's different components. Because this policy is what's going to define that, hey, this domain is protected with DMARC and 2 other authentication protocols, SPF and DKIM. So make sure you check all of these things before you just let the messages go through. And so if any of it ends up being fraudulent, this is the action that you need to take based on our policy. So this way, the receiving side is going to be able to follow your policy and not have to make decisions. But the receiving side has to have DMARC verification turned on. Okay, so I'm saying for verification, you're not creating something, you're turning something on. You're enabling something in your security gateways. So whether it's cloud security gateway or your email security gateway, whatever message from outgoing, from for incoming messages are coming through, that's where you're going to check to see if they have DMARC verification. You can have DMARC verification turned on there, and you're going to see all incoming messages. Do they have a DMARC policy? If they do, what is the policy, and what do we need to do if these messages and any of these messages are fraudulent? So it has to be two parts. So being you as the organization, technically you actually have to do both, right? You have to create the policy to protect your domain, but then you also want to protect your users by checking all incoming messages to see if there's a DMARC policy. So you can reduce the amount of domain spoofing type attacks. So you need to do both. We're not going to talk about DMARC verification, except for what I've already mentioned. The focus in this session is strictly going to be the policy. Why? Because you have to actually create a policy. For DMARC verification, it's just a checkbox typically in most cases. So you go into your email security gateways or your cloud security gateways and check to see there, do we have DMARC verification turned on? We don't, put in the checkbox or click on enable, whatever the process is for those tools. So that way you're checking all of that. And in some cases, you may have other options like overriding the policy. Do you want to send reports? So you can have the option of sending reports and things like that. So now, again, our focus is on the DMARC policy because that's actually something you have to create. It's not something that you're going to turn on yet. So things that you should have. So you don't have to have all of these right off the bat, but you need to have these. It's good to have these handy if you can have them handy. So like mail system servers used for the organization. That is more for SPF and DKIM, not so much for DMARC, right? But if you have that information, it doesn't hurt to have it because you may be creating your SPF and DKIM at the same time. You need to have at least admin levels to DNS. So whether if you're the DNS admin and you have that access, then you need to have admin level, or at least know who is your DNS admin. So who's responsible for it, right? And it's going to be the public-facing DNS system that we're creating these records on. So that's important, right? So know also your change control process. If there's a change control process, you may have to submit the records that need to be created, rather than just saying we need DMARC, DKIM, and SPF in place. So please create them. Now they may come back to you and say, look, well, what specifically do you want me to create? What is the record exactly? What are the values that you need me to put in? If you have a list of subdomains, it can be helpful, but it could be situations you don't have subdomains, but that's something you should be aware of. So this is for public-facing domains, public-facing subdomains. Okay, not internal ones. So you should have a list of not just your subdomains, but any public domains that your organization owns. Have those. Because what you can do is like you can say, okay, are these being used for mail or are they not being used for mail? Because if it's a publicly facing domain, then there's something you can do to protect that domain. And we're going to show you how to do that when we do the demonstration. But for subdomains, that's also important. Because if there are publicly facing subdomains, how are you going to implement your DMARC policy? Because there are certain tags you can use to protect those domains, whether they're used for email purposes or if they're not used for email purposes. And then SPF and DKIM, if you have those set up, great, that's awesome. But you need to know that they're there, and then that way you can determine, do you need to make any changes to them, or do you need to make an adjustment? Do you need any additional DKIM records? But if you don't, technically you can actually start with DMARC first and then go back to SPF and DKIM. But that's only if you use DMARC at the lowest level, right? Because there's 3 levels we'll talk about in the next slide. The first level is the lowest level, then the next 2 levels are your enforcement levels, right? Because once you start enforcing it and you don't have SPF and DKIM, things will break. Email's not going to get sent, or actually, sorry, email's not going to get delivered. So you have to be careful. So what are those policy levels? So those policy levels are none, quarantine, and reject. So again, none being the lowest, and then quarantine and reject being your enforcement level policies, right? So always start off with none. The reason for that is because none is you're putting yourself into monitored only mode. So basically that's saying that, look, we have a DMARC policy, yes, but nothing is to be filtered because of DMARC. So treat those messages normally and go through your other filters like you normally would, but just don't do you're not going to filter using DMARC. But why would you start at none? Because you want to get the reports that are being generated, and in those reports review, do you need to make any adjustments? Do you need to make any changes to SPF? Do you need to add more DKIM keys? Are those things that you need to do? So are those things that are required? Right? So those are the things that you need to have in place before you go into the enforcement levels. Because if you go to quarantine or reject and these things are not set up, then you're going to run into issues. You know, if both of these fail, then your messages can go into spam or junk folder. Right? You're going to face that problem. Or if you're like reject, the message is completely dropped. It's completely dropped at that point. All right. So make sure you have it SPF and DKIM in place before you go to quarantine and reject. Technically, you can get away with one or the other. You can have just SPF and not have DKIM and go to quarantine and reject. But the problem you're going to face is that if your SPF value fails, then those messages are definitely going to go to spam and junk folder because it has no other check to make sure that it's authorized, right? Because if SPF fails and you have DKIM and DKIM passes, then you're fine. You'll still send the message through because overall it's a pass, right? But if both fail, then you have a problem. So what type of record are you creating in DNS? So the record type is going to be TXT. So TXT, a text file, is what you're creating. Or sorry, text record is what you're creating. A text record in DNS. So when you're creating this record, typically in some cases when records would need a host name, right? So in most cases it just takes on the domain name for the host name, and that's all you need. You don't need to put in anything else. You don't have to have a unique name. But for DMARC, you do need to have a unique name because this is the only way it's going to be that the receiving side that has DMARC verification enabled, this is the only way they're going to know if you have a DMARC policy. So that name, the host name of that record is going to be _DMARC in lowercase. Always _DMARC. If you leave out the underscore, basically the receiving side that has DMARC verification enabled won't find your policy because they're specifically looking for _DMARC dot your domain name. Now again, depending on the type of system you're using, you may not have to add your fully qualified domain name after the record name. They may automatically append it for you, right? And you'll see this as we go into doing the demonstration. So just take that into account. Some cases you may have to add it, some cases you don't. Now the value of that record is what is going to be the actual policy. These are going to be the different components that are going to define that policy, right? It's going to define the authentication, it's going to define the reporting, and it's going to define the conformance aspect of DMARC. Right, as you can see this here. So you see a series of tags, each one is separated by a semicolon, and that semicolon is required to do the separation. If you leave out the semicolon, it breaks the policy, and basically your policy is not in use. It's not effective at that point. So once you put the semicolon in, now your policy is actually effective. So that's all that's going to happen. It's not going to break email. It's just going to basically say, well, your DMARC policy has errors in it, so we're not following your policy. We're not using it because we can't figure out what you have. So what are all these tags? So what we have here is just a nice slide where everything is listed. So everything is there. And again, if you're trying to copy these, don't worry about copying them. We will make the slides available to you. So a copy will be available so you can just take it from there instead of trying to write all of these down. So there are obviously, as you can see, there's multiple tags. We've broken them into different areas in terms of required, recommended, considered using, and optional. And we're going to go through each one of these tags individually in each slide in the next few slides. But the one that I want to start off with first is the V equals DMARC 1. That's your version number. And the reason I'm starting with that is because that is going to be the very first tag you will always use when creating your DMARC policy. It must start with V equals DMARC 1. Okay, there is no version 2 or 3. You may have read about it and people are calling it this DMARC 2.0. It's not version 2. So it's not DMARC V equals DMARC 2. What it basically is they're calling it 2.0 because you're using another new authentication mechanism called BIMI, which is brand indicator. So you're basically using an image to authenticate your domain. But that BIMI only works if you have a DMARC policy of reject. But it's always going to be V equals DMARC 1. You're not going to change that to V equals DMARC 2. At least there's no reports of that happening at this point. But anyways, BIMI I'm going to talk about in slightly more detail on October 17th in the wrap-up session. So always start with V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, right? Semicolon is the separator between each tag. The next tag that has to be in place is the P tag. The P tag is also actually defining what your policy is, right? So this is the conformance aspect. So it's either P equals none, or P equals quarantine, or P equals reject, semicolon. Okay, V tag first, P tag second, and then after that, whatever tags you wish to put in. Right, so this is defining your policy level for the domain that you're creating the policy for. But the P tag actually also can apply to all the subdomains for that particular domain. Right, so the P tag applies to not only that domain you're creating the policy for, but all the subdomains associated with that. So this is why I was talking about the subdomain list, because if there are if email is being used for some of those domains, this could potentially cause a problem. And we'll talk about towards the last tags what you can do to fix that issue. Okay, so it's you use either P equals none or quarantine or reject. Because remember, only one DMARC policy per domain. Then there's the RUA and RUF tag. These tags are what you're going to use to enable reporting. Right, this is where you put these tags in, and this is where you're going to find where the receiving side that has DMARC verification enabled, where they're going to send the reports to. Right, so there's two types of reports, RUA and for aggregate reports, and RUF for forensic or failure reports. Okay, those are the two types of reports. Now, technically, so I'm saying here on this slide that RUA is required and RUF is recommended. Okay, that's what I am saying. Technically, RUA and RUF are not required. Okay, they're not actually required. We're saying they're required, and I'll let you know why right now. So if you put in just V equals DMARC 1 semicolon, P equals none semicolon, what have you done? Yes, you created a DMARC policy, and it's a policy of none, but what are your plans with that? Right? What are you going to do with that? You're not doing anything at this point. Yes, you have the policy of none, but there's nothing going on. I mean, how are you going to know whether you should be going up to quarantine or reject? You won't unless you enable reporting, right? Unless you enable reporting, because the reports are going to tell you if you're ready to move up or not. So it's absolutely pointless, and it's a waste of time if you just put in V equals DMARC 1 semicolon, P equals none semicolon, you stop there, and that's it. You don't do anything else. You're not doing anything to protect your brand. You're not taking any actions to protect your brand and prevent spammers and phishers from using your domain name, right? Because P equals none is just monitored only mode. Nothing is going on. That's why, in our standpoint, we're saying RUA should be required, because the aggregate reports are going to tell you what you need to, if you're ready to move up or not. Because really quickly, the aggregate report is going to be the report that contains all the IP addresses that are using your domain name to send mail. All IP addresses. So it's not just the ones that are authorized by your SPF. So not just the ones that you have for your mail servers and the ones you know about. It could be the third-party vendors as well as the spammers and phishers that are using your domain name. So if the receiving side is seeing all this, it will report it back to you. So that's why this aggregate report at minimum is critical, because it's going to give you that information, because that's what you're going to analyze to say, here are the IP addresses. Are these all authorized? Oh, we're missing some. We need to update SPF. Oh, since we updated SPF, we need to have DKIM as well. Does this provide DKIM? Can we set it up? Plus, on top of that, these aggregate reports are going to tell you about SPF. What's happening with it? Are the domains being aligned? Is SPF passing the SPF verification? And is it being aligned? Is what domain is being used for SPF and SPF? Same thing happens with DKIM, right? With DKIM, it's going to tell you, is it passing or failing DMARC verification? Or sorry, DKIM verification? Is it is the domain aligned and what domain is being used for DKIM. That all that information will be in that report, so that way you can make the changes that you need and make the adjustments that you need, and then you can move up to quarantine and reject, because that's where you want to be, right? Quarantine and reject is the actual enforcement. That's where the actual filtering is happening. So that's why it's important, and we're, from our standpoint, we're saying that RUA should be required. When you get to P equals reject, fine. If you want to stop reports, that's your decision. I still recommend still using it, but if you want to stop using, then fine, whatever. But when you're at P equals none, you need to do the reports. You need to analyze those reports. The RUF for forensic, this one we're saying is recommended, and the reason because of this is that the type, it's not really technically a report. It's actually a sample message, or the actual message that's being delivered, right? So you actually get the full message, even though that message you're not the intended recipient of that message, you still get that message. But what you'll see is who was sending the message, who the recipient of the message is. You'll see the full message headers. You'll see the full message body. And in some cases, you'll actually get the attachment as well. But you can see what some of the issues can be when you get those types of things, because there's a privacy concern at that point now. I mean, what is actually in the message body? I mean, could there be PII? Could there be invoices attached? Could there be banking information? Could there be health information? Right? Could there be HR type information? So there's that risk that you're going to get those types of messages at this point. So this is why now a lot of third parties like Google, Microsoft, and the other email service providers, they've decided, like, you know what, we're not going to send RUF reports just for that reason. So we want to follow, because with the privacy concerns and privacy regulation and laws, we're not going to send those. I mean, a lot of them are now revisiting that to see, okay, should we actually consider it? But right now they're not doing it. So that's why those forensic and failure reports, you may not see too many of those. So when you're implementing this, it goes after the P tag, you put in RUA equals mail to : the email address. Semicolon RUF equals mail to : the email address, and semicolon. Right? This is how you would put it in. Now our recommendation is when you're putting in the email addresses, use a generic account. So something like DMARC @ or if you want to separate the two reports out, RUA-RUA and DMARC-RUF. You could do it that way. It's really totally up to you on how you want to do it. But use a generic one. Don't use your personal work email, right? For two reasons. One, the number of aggregate reports you get can be quite large, right? It really depends on how many domains you're sending to, your organization is sending to, will determine how many reports you get back. So if you're sending out to 100 different domains, then you potentially get 100 reports back, right? It really depends, again, if those domains have DMARC verification enabled, and then if they decide to send reports back to you. So rather than having your personal work account get a whole bunch of reports, have the generic account and then just give people who need access to that to get, to review whatever reports. Plus, from a security perspective, remember the DMARC tag, the DMARC policy is public. So anyone can go in and do an NS lookup or a dig or use those online DNS tools to find your DMARC record and therefore then extract your email address from it. And then, you could potentially get more spam because of that. So, but if you have a generic account and if that gets spam, whatever, it's not a big deal because at least this is only supposed to get, this email address is only meant for DMARC reports, nothing else. So you can delete everything else. Now you can have more than one email address. You just have to separate those email addresses with a comma, but every email address has to start with mail to : So RUA equals mail to : your first email, comma, mail to : the second email, comma, mail to : the third email, and so on. Just remember to end with a semicolon before you start the next tag. The other thing is to take into account by default, you can only send to, by default, you can only send to an internal email address. If you can technically send to somebody outside of your organization, but in order for them to receive those reports, they have to take additional steps. And I'm going to show you that when we do the demonstration. What's that additional record that needs to be created in order for them to be able to accept reports? Because this way, then you can't just send to somebody these reports and hammer them with 100 reports or so and then just spam them with us in essence, right? They have to be willing to accept those reports, and there has to be a record created in order to do that. So those are all the tags that we said are required and recommended, okay? So always V tag first, second tag is always the P tag, then after that, whatever order you want to put the tags in. But now these next set of tags we're talking about are optional tags. So optional meaning that if you do not put them into place, whatever the default setting is for that tag, that's what the policy is going to use. Right? So if you don't explicitly define it, the default value is what will be used. So they're still in use, but just the default value. So the first one is the FO tag. So the FO tag is going to be used in conjunction with the RUF tag. Why? Because this is what's going to say what to trigger, how to trigger those failure reports and those failure sample messages. What is the cause of it? So you have 4 options, the default being 0, so FO equals 0. So in this situation, if you go with the default, so whether you define it or not, it means that all underlying authentication mechanisms will, if all mechanisms fail to produce an aligned pass result, then generate these reports. Send us these sample emails. If you do 1, so FO equals 1, for any underlying authentication mechanism producing something other than an aligned pass result, then generate a report. And then D is only if there's a DKIM failure, and S is only if there's an SPF failure. Then send a sample email. I haven't really seen DNS being used, the D value or the S value being used that often. Mainly see 0 and 1. Most common, well, honestly, the most common one can be either one of those two. So people either leave it out and stick with the 0, or people will actually put in FO equals 1. But you can't go wrong with either one of those because you want to have it regardless. If it's DKIM and SPF, you want both, so that way you know what changes and adjustments you may have to make, and what's the actual email that's being broken because of DMARC. So you can make those adjustments and have the specifics. The next two are ADKIM and ASPF. So both of these have to do with alignment. So as long as DKIM is aligned and SPF is aligned, right? Because when we talked about SPF and DKIM in week 2, so what we mentioned is that when it was the verification. So verification and alignment are 2 different things. When people have SPF verification enabled, what that is doing is it's checking the message to see what's the envelope from domain, not the header from, the envelope from, and the return path from. What is that domain? We take that domain, look it up, and see what domains and IPs are authorized based on that domain. And as long as it's on the list, we're good. So that's SPF verification. For DKIM, the DKIM verification is where you're checking the domain that's in the signature. So it's being used to sign in the signature. That domain is being looked up for the public key, and you're matching that public key with the signature to see if everything is aligned correct. It matches correctly. So that's not doing domain alignment. Okay, it's because it's DMARC that's going to introduce the alignment aspect of it. Okay, it's DMARC that's bringing up the alignment. And what the alignment is basically saying now we're actually going to look at the from header. So for SPF, look at the from header and compare it to the envelope from header. For DKIM, look at the domain in the signature and compare that to the domain in the from header. And that's where you're going to make sure things match, because that's where alignment is happening. Now in DMARC, for ADKIM and ASPF, the default value is R. That means relaxed alignment. What does that mean? That means that you can actually use subdomains for DKIM and SPF and still allow this to be considered aligned and passing. So you can allow for subdomains to be used. And that's what, it's the default because you run into those situations when you come to third-party vendors, you may have to leave it relaxed, so they may be using subdomain values. But how do you know? That's where you have to look at the reports, right? The reports are going to tell you what the alignment is that's going on. So I'll tell you, here's the column for alignment. Is it aligned or failed unaligned? And here's the domain that's being used for SPF or DKIM. And if everything is aligned, everything matches, you're good. So you're under alignment. But you also have the option for strict alignment. If you do strict alignment, that means it has to be the exact domain. You cannot use a subdomain. The domain has to match. So the SPF domain and the from domain has to be exact. The DKIM domain and the DKIM signature domain must be exact. It cannot be and it is not allowed to be any subdomains. And again, how do you know? You look at the reports again. The reports are going to define and dictate to you that this is what the settings are, this is what's going on, and whether you can put in ADKIM equals S or ADKIM or ASPF equals strict. So don't go to strict until you actually review those reports. Otherwise, stay at relax. And the most commonly I've seen is people that stay at relax mode. I have not seen too many people actually put in strict. Then there's the RF and RI. Both of these tags have to do with reporting. So RF is report format. It's defining what format to use when these reports are being sent. Honestly, I have not seen the RF tag being used. People just leave it to the default, which is AFRF, because it's just really two different formats, and it doesn't really matter in terms of the aggregate reporting backend. The aggregate reporting backends will take both of those formats because it's still XML. Right, it's more just like incident handling tools and stuff like that. That if you want to send these reports and ingest those reports into there, that's where it may matter. So you can select between it, but my recommendation is just leave it to the default. And we provide the RFCs in case you want to go into more detail. But due to time, we're not going to go into a deep dive of the reports because that's an hour in its own. The RI tag is for report interval. So that's basically defining how often should the receiving servers that use DMARC verification and send reports, how often should they send the reports to you? So how often should they do that? And it's in seconds. So the default is 84,600 seconds, which is 24 hours. It's not too often that I've seen people increase it. It's really where I see people decrease the value to so more closer to like an hour. Why? Because that's where people are going to say, okay, you know what? We want to move up to reject and quarantine for whatever reason, whether it be like a governing policy, a mandate that's in place, or they're seeing their domain being part of a spam campaign. So they want to get the reports, the aggregate reports sooner and the forensic reports sooner, so that way they can actually see and say, oh, okay, you know, we need to make these changes. Let's make the changes to SPF. Let's create the additional DKIM keys if we need to, and then get our way up to reject as soon as we can. So otherwise, most people tend to stick with the default and wait the 24 hours. It may not be exactly 24 hours, but you know, give or take 24 hours. Then there's the PCT tag, which is optional as well. This is the percentage tag. What this is defining is what percentage of messages that are being delivered using your domain name are impacted by the DMARC policy. So the value is anywhere between 0 to 100, the default being 100. Right, and honestly, my recommendation is don't use this tag. Leave it as a default as 100, because you're not going to be able to define or determine which messages are being impacted and which ones are not being impacted. Most people who have been using this, they're using it for the reason of saying that, well, we know at least, you know, if we put in the PCT at 10%, we know that 10% of the messages could potentially be quarantined, whereas the remaining 90% are not going to be impacted by the policy, which is fine. I mean, if you want to do it that way, but really, best thing is to do 100, because if you're going to go to quarantine or reject, just go to 100, because none is where you're actually making that determination of whether the messages are being impacted or not. Right, but you will want to put in ever P equals none with the PCT tag. You shouldn't do that. But if you do decide to use this, just be careful with it, because if you put in a policy of quarantine and a percentage of 0, you're basically using P equals none at that point. Right? Because you're just saying that, well, none of our messages are being impacted by the quarantine policy, which is basically just like saying P equals none. And then if you use P equals reject with a percentage of 0, that's like using quarantine. Correct? You're saying that none of our messages are going to be rejected, but instead of defaulting all the way down to none, it says, okay, we're going to make this quarantine. So I'll use quarantine at 100%. So be wary of that fact. And then the last tag is the SP tag. This is also optional, but we're saying that you should consider using this depending on your situation. So the SP tag is going to define your subdomain policy. So the subdomain policy that applies to the domain you're creating this DMARC policy for, right? So if you do not have the SP tag, right, remember I said the P tag automatically applies to that domain as well as the subdomain for that domain. But you can put in an SP tag for various reasons, and the policy levels that are for the SP tag are the same as the P tag. So SP equals none, SP equals quarantine, and or SPF equals reject. So or, not and. So why would you consider using it, or why should you consider using this? There's a few reasons. One could be where you've looked at it and you say, okay, well, you know what? We actually have no subdomains that are being publicly used. Or you could say that we do have subdomains for public use, but none of them are used for email purposes. But we're still working on our top level domain, and we're still trying to protect that top level domain because we're still at P equals none. So what we do to protect the subdomains is put in the tag SP equals reject, semicolon. So SP equals reject, because that way your subdomains are being protected. They're not being used for fraudulent purposes, because they're not supposed to be used for any level of email, while we're still working at P equals none for the top level domain. So that's one example. It could be also the other situation where you have multiple subdomains and some of them are actually being used for email, if not all of them are being used for email. And then those subdomains have their own IT and email department. So if you move up to reject or quarantine, they're going to be impacted by that as well. And that's a problem because they haven't set anything up yet, or they may not even know about DMARC. I mean, hopefully you tell them before you do any of this, but if you go to P equals reject, they're impacted. So what you can do is you add in the SP tag of none. So SP equals none, semicolon. And what that does is basically says, okay, this domain is protected at an enforcement level, but our subdomains will be at none. They're not protected. So what the subdomains can do then at that point is they can go ahead and put in their own SPF, they can put in their own DKIM records, and they can create their own DMARC policy. And that DMARC policy they apply at that level is what is going to be used. So that's where you want to take this into account. That's why having that list of subdomains, if any, will help. All right. So this is where you can do that movement and make the changes that you need to make and protect yourselves, while at the same time either protecting your subdomains or allowing your subdomains to catch up if they're being used for email. So that's where you're going to be doing. That's what we're going to be creating, right? You don't need to put in all these tags that you see here, FOAD. You don't have to put them in. If you don't put them in, it automatically reverts to the default setting for those. Really what you see at the basic, that's all you need. So V equals DMARC1, semicolon, P equals none, semicolon, then RUA equals mail to your email address, semicolon, RUF equals mail to colon, your email address, semicolon. That's all you need to get started, right? And then you review your reports to make your way up to quarantine or reject, right? So this part's going to be easy, and you're going to see how quickly we can put in the DMARC record. The harder part is going to be reviewing those reports and making your way up to quarantine reject. All right, so let's go ahead and let's actually go and do this. So we're going to use oneandone.com or Ionis, and we're going to use Google Cloud DNS to show you some examples of how to do this. And we're going to use Office 365. We use Office 365 to go through and show you this. So let me switch over to my browser since this is all browser based. So here you see this is oneandone or Ionis.com. So this is one tool that we're going to use. In this, we're going to talk about GCA.com. We're also using Google Cloud Platform. So we're going to use Google Cloud DNS and the domain here we're going to be using is gotdmarc.org. Okay, so these are the two platforms that we're going to use, and I'm going to provide you examples. And we're going to use Office 365 as well. So let's create SPF first. So in order to create SPF record, if you remember from week 2, it's going to be a TXT record, and we can only have one SPF record, right? Only one record can exist. So when you're creating the SPF record, you have to, especially in Google Cloud Platform, the way it works in here, it actually consolidates everything into one. In most DNS systems, you actually create separate lines for everything. Here, it actually puts it all into one, so just for organizational purposes. In actual DNS, it would actually be separate lines. So when you do a lookup or anything like that, you'll see separate lines. You won't see it consolidated. So when you create an SPF record, the name of the record is @ or null. So meaning that you don't need to have a name for that type of TXT record. You just have to provide the value for it. So in this situation, we already have a TXT with just the fully qualified domain name. It's a Google verification. So what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to actually just click on the pencil, and I'm going to add an item to this. Now, depending again on what type of systems you use, you may or may not need the quotation marks. So in this case, if I start typing out v equals SPF1 space, I get a warning saying like, no, you actually need these quotes. So you need to put in quotation marks. So I'm going to put them in. And I'll show you what like Ionis does, because some of them you don't have to put the quotes in. So I'm going to put v equals SPF1. So what do I put in next? Well, right now, based on what I see in my DNS, I have MX records. So I'm just going to add in MX, put in that tag, because it's basically saying that the MX records, the mail exchanger records, are authorized to send on my behalf, and that's it. So I put in the -all, end quote, to saying that that's it. There's nothing else that's allowed to send on my behalf. So I go ahead and save it, and now I have an SPF record right here. So it's the same thing you can do in Ionis or 1-in-1, but it's actually a little bit different. So if you click on add record, you're still creating a text record, but what Ionis does, aside from logging me out, what Ionis does, it actually separates, it actually creates and gives you another TXT record, but it calls it out as SPF. So even though it's a TXT record you're creating, it's just labeling it as SPF. So not everyone does that. Most people just, most email service provider or DNS hosting providers will just have you create a text record, right? So here I'm looking at the DNS record types that I can add, and you see it says SPF, but in parentheses it says you're actually creating a text record. So in this case, if they give you SPF, choose SPF. Don't choose TXT, because this is what they actually want you to do. So I click on this, and then here's where I supply the information. So you'll see below what Ionis does is actually gives you a preview of what you're creating. So you see by default, it actually puts in GCA.com. So I don't actually have to put anything in here. I can just put in the @ symbol. So if you see, if I put an @ it's not adding the @ down here. It's just basically saying that I'm keeping this blank. Right, and then I can actually define soft fill or hard fill, but just note that if you choose one of these, it could potentially add in its own information to your SPF. So these are two that are their email servers, but you know what? We're not using those. So we're just going to put in v equals SPF, -all, and put in MX, right? And that's what all we would do. And then I would save it, but in this case, I'm not going to save it because I'm going to do something different with the SPF value. Now, here we have our SPF, but well, you know what? We're using Office 365 as well. So we need to say that Office 365 is allowed to send mail on our behalf. So what do I have to do in this case? So what I'm going to have to do is now go into my Office 365 Admin Center and figure out what is it that I need to add, right? So you don't necessarily have to go into the Admin Center. You can look up the Microsoft TechNet stuff and the technical documentation, and it'll give you the information as well. But here I can just take it and copy and paste it. So this is the way I'm going to show you. So what I have to do is in the Admin Center, go to Show All, click Setup, and under Setup, choose Domains, and under Domains, choose .DMARC. And then here, this is going to tell me all the DNS records that I need, right? So it tells me here I need to create a mail exchanger record, which already exists. And I need to create a text file with a host name of @, so either blank or null. And this is the value that needs to be in that text record for SPF. Now, when you're actually setting up Office 365 for the first time, it has the ability to connect to a Cloud DNS provider and create these records for you, as long as you give it permission to do so. But just take into account, if you do that route, it actually can potentially create 2 SPF records for you. So like if in this case, I have an SPF record, and if I were to create and go through the setup process and have it automatically create for me, it'll actually create another SPF record. It doesn't append to it. So be careful with that, okay? Because you can only have 1 SPF, you can't have 2. So what do I do in this situation, right? I already have an SPF value in place. So what do I do? Because I can't copy this whole thing and create a whole new record. I'm not going to copy the whole thing and put it in the record. What I need to do is just take what's in between the SPF and the -all and copy that. That's just all I need to take in and append or add to my current SPF. So I go in here, type it in, put that space in it, and there you go. Now I've included the Office 365 mail servers and authorized it now. And I just click on save. There you go. Now I have what I need for SPF and to protect it. And this is what you would do with other third parties as well. So you just take this part that you need, not the entire thing. Just take the part you need and add it to your current SPF record. Some of them you may have to take additional steps as well, where they may say, okay, once you add it, come back to us and click on verify, just to make sure that we're verifying that it actually exists and everything is set up correctly. So be wary of that. There may be an additional step on when you're using third-party providers. With Office 365, you don't really have to do anything. I mean, you can have it check DNS just to confirm that everything is correct and everything is set up correctly. Okay, so that's what you're doing when you're handling SPF. Now DKIM. So what are we doing in terms of DKIM? So with DKIM, when you're creating a DKIM record, it can be one of two types. It can either be a TXT or it can be a CNAME. So it really depends on who you're working with and what you're actually utilizing to create and to handle those keys, the private key and public key. Most third-party vendors will have you create a CNAME. And the reason for that is because they want to actually handle the private key and public keys for you, rather than you having to worry about them. So they'll handle it, they'll handle the rotations and things like that. Right? But then there are other vendors that say, you know what, we'll handle the private key, but here's the public key. In those situations, if they're providing you with a public key, then you have to create a TXT record. Okay, and or if you're generating the keys on your own, using tools like OpenDKIM or DKIM Exchange, so if you're creating them on your own, it's going to be a text record that you're creating. Okay, and I'm going to show you both, and when we set this up here. So first thing let's focus on is on Office 365. So what do we do with Office 365? So what you actually have to do in Office 365 is you actually have to turn on and enable DKIM. And you have to do that in pretty much most cases when it comes to third-party vendors. They're going to want you to turn it on. They basically want you to create the record first and then go back and enable it to confirm that everything is set up correctly. Right? And that's what you're going to need to do. So this is what you have to do in Office 365. So going back into the admin center, I scroll down, choose Exchange. Under Exchange, I'm going to choose Protection, and then for Protection, choose DKIM. And what you're going to see in this case is that there's two domains. There's one domain that's yourdomain.onmicrosoft.com, and then the other one is your actual domain name, so .dmarc.org. Okay? So by default in Office 365, .dmarc.onmicrosoft.com is what's actually being used to sign your records. So you can see here it's actually enabled by default. And it should stay enabled. Don't ever disable it. And I'll explain why in a bit. So when DMARC verification happens, it's actually going to pass. The reason being is because when it looks at the DKIM signature, it's going to see .dmarc.onmicrosoft.com. That's the domain it's going to look up and look for the public key. It sees the public key for that domain and says, okay, well, does it match the signature? It does, so we're good to go. So DMARC verification is passing. However, DMARC alignment is not going to pass. In that case, it's going to be failed unaligned. Why? Because .dmarc.onmicrosoft.com does not match the from header, right? The from header is going to have @.dmarc.org. So now your alignment is off. So ADKIM equals R is not going to fix this issue, right? Because that's the default for your policy anyways, right? Because it has to be a subdomain. So it has to be a subdomain of .dmarc.org in order for it to pass or be aligned. So what do? This is where you have to enable .dmarc.org to fix those alignment issues. And you have to turn it on here, because then that way now everything for .dmarc.org is being signed by .dmarc.org. Now, like I mentioned before, you can't just go in and enable it. We have to create the records first. Okay, the record has to be created first, which makes sense. That public key has to be in place, because why would you start signing things with no public key, right? Because if people have DMARC verification enabled, there's a problem now, because it's going to say, well, there's no public key to match it against, so should we consider this a fail at that point? So you have to create the records first and then enable it. But the nice thing is, if I click on enable here, there'll be a little pop-up window that's going to tell me what type of record and the values for those records. Right, so here it says CNAME record does not exist. Publish the following 2 CNAME records first. But the problem is these are not the actual records. These are the values of the record. You actually have to name the record. And in Microsoft, by default, the name of the record is always going to be selector1._domain key and selector2._domain key. So you can have more than one DKIM record. You're not restricted to just one. And you can have CNAME and text records for DKIM. You can have both, right? Depending on how and what the requirements are in terms of implementing it. So it is okay to have both CNAME and text DKIM records. Okay, so what I'm going to do is copy this, and now I'm going to go into DNS and create it. So what I'm going to do in this case is, so with Google, you're looking for selector1._domain key. It doesn't exist. Okay, I'm going to add this record. So all I'm going to do is, again, selector1._domain key. Because remember, ._domain key is required. The selector is required, and the ._domain key are required. Otherwise, this doesn't work. And Microsoft requires it to be selector1 and selector2. So if you put in something else, it's not going to work. You're going to break things. They're saying it needs to be a CNAME. I'm just going to change this to an hour. And then in the canonical name, I'm going to put in and paste in the record that they're telling me to put in with the S. And there you go. Click on create. Now I have one DKIM key for Office 365. So, but now I need to have 2. So you have to put in both in order to enable it. So I add the record set, create selector2._domain key .dmarc.org, make it a CNAME. Again, I'll change this to 1 hour. Put in my domain that I'm pointing to, and then change it to selector2. Now, I mentioned also do not disable on .dmarc.microsoft.com. This is a reason. Because you see where it's pointing to? It's actually pointing you to use .dmarc.onmicrosoft.com. I mean, you can't disable it anyways. But if for some reason, if you use like PowerShell or things like that, you can actually go around about disabling, but don't disable it, because if you disable it, your key is broken at that point. Okay? So .dmarc.onmicrosoft.com, we leave that enabled. So I click on create. Now I have my 2 records that I'm using. But the thing is that these 2 DKIM keys are used for this domain, for protection.outlook.com. It's used for what I'm saying in here, include spf.protection.outlook.com. It's not going to apply to this other system that I have, which is exchange1.dmarc.org. So I need to have a DKIM set up for that. And that's an on-prem server, for example. So we'll say it's an Exchange server. So what you would actually do is you'd actually install something called DKIM-Exchange. It's an open source tool. There are other open source tools you can use as well. And that's what you're going to use to create the DKIM keys and then do the DKIM signing. So I'm on a Mac, so I don't obviously have that tool available. But if you go back and look at the Windows session, in the Windows session, we actually show you how to use that tool. Or if you're using a Linux system, for Linux, it's something called OpenDKIM. That's the tool you use to generate the key and then connect it to your SendMail or postfix server. So again, if you want to know how OpenDKIM works, if you look at the bind session, we show you how to use that to generate the keys, the private and public keys. So in this case, for now, what I'm going to use is there's a site out there called DKIM Core. I'm going to use this. Do not use this tool to create your private keys and public keys. I mean, it's nice and easy because you can just put in the domain name and click generate, and it generates your private key and public key. But in all honesty, do you really want to use a public site to create your keys? Because you see right here, it says all your keys will be kept here for at least a month, probably forever. right? So they're keeping it on their servers. And if they get compromised in any way, your private key and public key are now out there. I mean, your public key is going to be out there anyway, but now your private key can potentially get out there, and that's a problem. So don't use this. I'm just using this as an example. Okay, that's the only reason, because I need something to give me what the text record that I want to create and show you how to create that text record. So here it's showing me in a bind format how to create the record. So if you're using other tools, it tells me my for tiny DNS. If you use it, you use a raw format and so on. So what I'm going to do in this case here is what I'm going to focus is on this, right? This is the public key that I need to put into DNS. But remember, I don't need to have everything in here because this is the full name of the record. I don't need the full name, right? Because in Google and in Ionis, it automatically appends that. And majority of the cloud DNS providers, it'll actually append the domain. So you don't have to add the domain in there. All I need is this part because that's the selector information. So the selector is 157.0.1.2.173.DMARC. That's the selector. And then ._ the domain key is required for it to be a DKIM key or DKIM record. So I'm going to go back to Google, click on add record set, paste that information in. It says it needs to be a text record, so I change it to text. And then I'm going to go back here and take everything here and copy this and paste this into here. Click create, and now I have my text-based record. Actually, I should not have included the parentheses, but it's fine. So the only thing to take into account is that when you're doing it when you're creating your own DKIM keys, just realize what the size of the key is. Is it 1024? Is it 2048? Right, the larger the key is, the better, but not all cloud DNS systems support 2048. And the way you'll find out is when you actually try to implement it, it's going to reject it if it doesn't support it. But if you try to put it in and it rejects it, try working with the help desk of that DNS provider and see if they can create it for you. Because in some cases they can create it. It's just the front end that they made available to you just doesn't allow you to put that in the right way. So check with the help desk first before switching to 1024. Okay? So take that into account. All right, so now we have SPF. Now we have our DKIM records. Let's create a DMARC record. So now when it comes to Office 365 or any other third-party tool, they're going to refer you somewhere to create a DMARC record. They're not going to tell you how to do it, right? So you can go searching online for different setup guides and whatnot. So there's plenty of setup guides that will help you go through that process. We have one. GCA has one they can go to. So you just go to dmarc.globalcyberalliance.org and just go to setup DMARC, and there's a guide there that'll help you go through the process of creating a record. And then you just take that information and put it in as needed. But we're just going to go ahead and just go and start creating one. Whoop. That's not where I wanted to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a record. So remember, when you're creating a DMARC record, it has to be _DMARC. It has to be _DMARC and then the domain name. It has to be a text record. And then under TXT is where you start creating the record. So remember, when you create it, in most cases, it's going to tell you whether you need the quotes or not. And we already tried it before without the quotes, and it said, no, you need quotes. So I'm going to put in quote V equals DMARC1 semicolon, right? Because that's what we have to start with. We have to start with a version number. The next thing we have to have is the policy that we're going to implement. And we're going to start off with none, right? Because it's got DMARC. We're doing this. We're creating this for the first time. Brand new system. We have the email set up. We know what's going on. So this is what we're going to do. We also know that, well, this does not have any subdomains. So while I'm going through and checking SPF and DKIM, we're going to make sure that none of the subdomains can actually be used. And then I'm going to go in and put in RUA equals because I want to see the reports. So that way I can make the determination of moving up to quarantine or reject. And I also want to see if any forensic reports get generated as well. So I'm going to add that as well. Semicolon. And then remember, when you do this, make sure you have the end quote. Do create, and there you go. Oh, now I have a DMARC record. So you can see, I don't know if anyone is timing me, but you see that took me less than a minute. And yes, I have more experience about it for the 4 years, 5 years worth of experience, but Really, honestly, that's how quickly it should take you, especially if you're the admin of the system. Right? That's how long it should take you, especially if someone gives you the information. That shouldn't take you long to put it in. Now, if I need to make a change to it, I just go and basically come back in here, click on the pencil, and then make the changes that I need to make. Right? So now I want to make this equal to reject. So I just remove the SP equals. I could leave the SP equals in there if I wanted to. That's perfectly fine. But remember, the SP tag automatically takes on what the P tag is. So it's not necessary to put it in. Right? And all those other tags that I did not put in automatically are set to default. But now I reject. I still want to get reports because that's out of habit. I like getting those reports just to review them and see who the spammers and phishers are. And then I can add them to like a block list for those who I determine to be spammers and phishers. I can take their IPs or look up their domains and add them to a block list, especially if they're confirmed to be used for just malicious activity. That's a whole analysis perspective. But then I can also look at the reports and say, hey, look, I'm looking at my DKIM, and my DKIM actually always happens to be set to the same from domain, and it's always aligned. I'm not using any subdomains. It's always the same. So I can put in ADKIM, or I put in S. It should be ADKIM equals S instead of being relaxed, which is the default. I don't have to put in ASPF because I'm seeing some things going on there and I'm seeing some subdomain usage. So let's leave that as relaxed. So I'll just leave it out. But I can explicitly define it if you want to. You can put in ASPF equals R. I mean, doesn't hurt to do that. That's, if for your own sake you just want to put that in there, that's fine. There's no harm in that. And then I just save it, and now you see this is where I'm going in and modifying things. Now, in most cases, when it comes to dealing with those reports, the things that you're going to modify the most are going to be your SPF record. You're going to probably add additional DKIM records, but with DMARC, you're just going to make minor changes. In most cases, the only change people tend to make is the policy level. And then sometimes they may add these other ones in there, but they may just leave them to be the default. All right, so that's what you're doing when you're creating. So we created SPF records, we created 2 types of DKIM records, and we created our DMARC record. Right, now one thing that you might be thinking about is like, well, what if I have a domain that's not being used for email purposes, but there is a public domain that I'm using? So what do we do in those types of situations? So what you can do is, and this is where I'm now going to go to Ionis, we have GCA.com. It's not used for email purposes, but we own the domain. So we want to protect this domain and prevent it from being used in any spamming type campaign, right? Even though we don't have like MX records or anything like that. So what do? We're going to create 2 types of records, and that's for this. One type of record is going to be another SPF record. So we're still going to create SPF again, or a text record. It's still going to be @ so a blank, but then we're going to put in v equals SPF1 - all, and that's it. We're not going to do anything more than that. No MX tags, no include tags. It's basically, in essence, a blank SPF record. Because you're basically saying that there's nothing authorized to send mail on our behalf. Because this is not used for email purposes. So I have an SPF record because if people are just doing SPF verification and not DMARC verification, at least they can look at this and say, okay, well, we're not supposed to be getting messages using this domain. Because according to SPF, these are there's nothing coming from that, so all messages using that domain are a hard fail. But then you also create a DMARC record as well. So you click on add record, txt, and then put in. Remember, the host name is _DMARC. So always _DMARC. And then under value, now in this case, I'm not putting in the quotes. Remember, because Ionis by default adds the quotes for you. So you don't need to type that in the value. So I'm just going to start writing v equals DMARC1 semicolon, p equals reject semicolon. And that's really all I need. Okay, that's all I need. But I'm always being, from a security standpoint, I want to actually know, is this domain ever going to actually be used by somebody in case there is a spamming campaign? Because I want to just be careful about my reputation. So I'm going to put in RUA equals mail to, smirzak, in this case, smirzak.dmarc.org. Now, the thing is, I'm sending this to a domain outside of this domain. So that's a problem because .dmarc.org is by default not allowed to accept these reports. So I might be putting this in the mail to, but that doesn't mean that .dmarc.org is going to accept those reports. Okay, so I have to actually do another step, or at least I have to talk to the owners of .dmarc.org and say, hey, look, I want you to receive my reports, and I want you to help me out with these reports. Can you please accept our reports? So in this case, let me go ahead and save this. So what I will do now is that going back to here in .dmarc's domain, I'm going to add another record. And this record has to exist in order to accept the reports, okay? The record is going to be the domain where you want the reports from, or you're accepting reports from, ._report ._DMARC. Because what you're basically saying here is you're saying that .dmarc.org is willing to accept DMARC reports for GCAA.org. That's what this record is stating. So this is going to be a text record as well. And then you're going to, again, create a value of, quote, v equals DMARC1, semicolon, end quote. That's it. Because it's not an actual policy. All this is doing is saying, like, we're using DMARC version 1, but we want reports. This is how we're going to define reports. You're not going to put in RUA or P equals, because none of that applies in this case. So I just click create. Now I can actually get reports from GCAA. Oh, actually, it should have been, sorry, should have been .com, because it's the .com address, not the .org. But either way, I mean, so this is where now I'm allowed to accept reports. Otherwise, I wouldn't get reports. The only exception is that Google will actually still send you the reports, regardless of whether you have this line in here. I'm not sure why they're doing that or why they're overriding this part of it, but they do, because I'm actually getting reports at .dmarc.org from people who have followed our videos, and they followed it to the T. They actually put in my email address. So I'm only getting Google reports. So Google tends to bypass that. But either way, these are the different tags that you're going to set up. Those are the different things that you're going to do in this case. All right, so those are all the tags. So let me switch back to our presentation. Just have 2 more slides just to wrap up. So what are the next steps? So now that you know how to create these records and how to do this, go ahead and do it. Implement it. Put it into place. But start off at P equals none, so that way you're not breaking anything, right? Because P equals none, remember, that's monitored only mode. Get the reports. Start reviewing those reports. Take a look at the reports. Ask questions during week 5 and 6. So the sessions that you're attending, ask the subject matter expert, hey, this is what I'm seeing. What does that mean? What do I do? If they can't answer it during their session, you're always welcome to email us and ask us those questions. You could post it to the community forum that we have that's free to access and free to use, right? And that's going to have a whole community. It's not just GCA people. It's people from other organizations as well, and people who are subject matter experts as well for DKIM, SPF, and DMARC. Okay? And we're willing to help you in any way along the way to get started. So as a reminder, the last remaining webinars are weeks 5 and 6. There's about 7 sessions, and there's technically 7 different sessions. The topic is the same, but the presenters are different for each one of those. They're from different organizations, and they're going to use different tool sets. Okay? You don't have to attend all 7 if you don't want to. Attend which ones that make more sense to you, right? But at least attend 2. I would at least recommend attend 2 of those sessions, 2 other sessions out of the 7, just so you can get different perspectives. And you can just see the different tool sets and get a different visualization, and maybe get different ideas on how to review some of these reports. Okay, these are educational. They're not marketing presentations. These are educational. They're going to teach you the different types of reports, what those reports are, how to view them in a human readable format, and what actions you need to take. That's what the focus is on each one of these sessions. And then also don't forget, there's a wrap-up session, which I'm going to be presenting. And it's just going to be a wrap-up. So just a quick overview of everything that happened over the boot camp, as well as talking about things like BIMI, things like ARC, and then a few other email authentication mechanisms you may want to consider using as well. So at this point, I know we're 10 minutes over. I am willing to stay longer in case there are any questions. So please feel free to post those questions on the questions box in your control panel, and I'll take the time to answer those questions. If you cannot stay any longer, then please, thank you very much for joining this session. You're more than welcome to email us at either one of those email addresses for any questions you may have. And you can also send us any questions that you have that if you don't get the chance to post it here. So there is one question that I want to answer because I believe I answered one of the two. So I mean, quickly, is it okay to have both CNAME and TXT DKIM records? Yes, you can have both. The other question is, if DKIM records are not entirely correct or aligned yet, will recipient domains ignore that as long as we have not published a DMARC policy? Technically, yes, but the thing you have to take into account is that if they're doing DKIM verification, then you're going to run into issues, right? So it might not be DMARC that's going to cause, because you don't have the policy, but if they have DKIM verification set up, then you could potentially run into issues. Problem is you don't know whether people have DKIM verification enabled or not, unless they tell you something or they actually send a bounce back message saying like this message was bounced because of this reason, right? So you can create the DKIM records and do that in place, but not have a DMARC policy. That's perfectly fine. Yeah, you don't have to have the DMARC policy when you're creating DKIM or even SPF. You can do the DMARC afterwards. My only recommendation is while you're creating and updating SPF and you're creating your DKIM records, I do recommend having DMARC in place at P equals none, because the reports can help assist you with making sure that everything is actually passing and failing, and everything is being aligned. Because that's how you're going to find out, right? Because DKIM verification by default has no reporting mechanism. DMARC reporting is going to tell you what to do and whether you need to make any fixes or any adjustment, especially if you start off at P equals none. So do that. Put in a DMARC policy of none so you can see what's going on with both DKIM and SPF, right? Because the receiving side knows what's going on, but they're not telling you. The only way they can tell you is by sending those reports. If we are at reject policy and the sender is also set at reject policy, what issue is caused? There is no issue because those are completely independent of themselves. Remember, that policy only applies to your domain, right? So the receiving side's DMARC policy doesn't matter because that's not going to impact them receiving your email, right? So the policies for each sending organization applies only to that organization. It does not apply for receiving from that organization. The verification is what's going to cause any potential issues, right? The DMARC verification is checking to see what the sender's policy is, and it's going to follow that sender's policy. So if your organization and the organization you're sending to both have reject policy, that doesn't matter, because you sending out is not going to be impacted by somebody else's reject policy. That reject policy is only going to be applying when you're receiving the message. Okay, hopefully that made sense and that answered the question. So it's only policy and verification. Those are the two components that are factoring. Policy for sending, receiving is the verification. So it's not sending is a policy and receiving is a policy. No, sending policy, receiving verification, and vice versa. Those are the only things that play a factor. Right, so I'm not seeing any other questions right now, so I'll wait one more minute at 1:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If I don't see any questions, we'll end the session, and hopefully everyone will see you during weeks 5 and 6 for the remaining sessions. Okay, so it's 1:15. I haven't seen any more questions. So if you didn't get a chance to answer the question or you're still thinking about the question, feel free to email us or post it on the community forum, and then we'll try to get to that answer as quickly as we can, or respond to that question as quickly as we can. So again, thank you for joining this session, and hopefully we'll see you during weeks, at least a few sessions during weeks 5 and 6. So enjoy the rest of your day or the rest of your evening, depending on where you are in the world.